Hello and welcome to the donation presentation. We are Donation. I'm Harry. This application was built with the lovely Dan as well, and it functions as a community-led donation application. Our MVP was to ensure that a user could create a donation, donate that item, and then search for those donations. When a donation is donated, the donors have select meetup points where they can go and drop off the donation with other users of the application. When building the application, we chose to follow the Pern stack, this being PostgreSQL, Express, React, and Node.js. We chose this as it is a flexible, robust, and scalable stack to use, and we were familiar with it as a result of the course. We utilize Meta for Developers as a new technology in order to utilize its API for user authentication. In addition to this, we utilize Postman to check our backend API requests, Jest for elements of front-end testing, and Mocha and Chai for testing on the backend. In terms of our backend, we use Node and Express to build our API. In this process, we utilize migration tables, routes, and controllers. We tested this with Mocha and Chai. Following on from this, we used Postman to send HTTP GET and POST requests to our database stored in pgadmin, until we had it linked up to our front end, at which point we used our front end to populate this. Hello and welcome to the backend code for our application. To begin with, I'd like to talk you through the migrations and why we use them. To start with, we create the donations table, which takes in the values as listed here. However, as our application grew in complexity, we realized that this was not enough. As such, we used SQL to add new columns to the table, first drop-off, and then donator. Moving into our source, we have our controllers and our routes. Our first export here creates the donation. This takes in the value of name, quantity, expiration, donator, and drop-off, and inserts them into the donations table via a POST request, as shown here in our routes. Following on from this, we have our get all donations. This returns all donations that are present within the database to the user. This is done as a GET request and is shown here. Following on from this, we have our search donations. This queries a name value as a template literal and returns it from the donations table where that value is found. If it's not, no donations will be found and there will be an internal server error. Moving down here, we have our test files, which utilize Mocha and Chai. And that is the basis of our backend. I'd like to use this section to talk about some issues we had surrounding the backend. To begin with, you may notice that there are a number of files within this which are not used. For example, we have a create user table here, and a user controller and a user route. We created these as we were coming towards the end of our application, we realized that the Meta API that we use only allowed for one user to be logged in. Therefore, we would have to create separate users. If we look within the donation.js here, we have a number of exports which do work within Postman, but make no sense if we have an application with only one user currently logged in. This update quantity export uses a patch request to change the quantity of an item. For example, if a donor had 10 apples, a user would be able to request 5 of those apples, and the donor would be left with 5. However, as we only have one user currently working within this application, it doesn't make sense to implement. Moving forward, we'd like to either extend the Facebook Meta API and take the data from it within and enter it into the user table, or perhaps implement a separate user login, which utilizes a more conventional approach. I will now pass you over to Dan, who will talk you through the front end of our application.
Hello and welcome to the front end section of our presentation. So we used React. It felt comfortable since we've been using it on the course. It provided us with ways that we could manipulate data. So using state and useEffect, it has allowed us to manage data from within our components. The state that we have implemented allows us to update, fetch, and manipulate the data. I think at the heart of our application is the CRUD practices. So the create, read, update, and delete. So this is the heart of our application. We used the Facebook login API from Meta for Developers, which allowed us to have a Facebook user login where we do not have to worry about the authentication of that user's private data. But it also gave us an idea to use context within our application and to use that data arriving in from external parties. All in all, That is the heart of our application. So let's have a little look. Okay, so this is the front end, the UI of our application. DoNation, a donation nation. Our homepage just contains simple user functionality of the application. You log in with Facebook, you can browse available donations, you can pick them up at certain locations through Manchester. With each donation, you are helping out to fight combat waste. So, a user logs in with Facebook. As you can see, I'm already logged in. It returns an object from the Facebook Meta for Developers API with, this is my username. It has my profile picture and the data about that. It also has a user ID. This object we have taken into context throughout our entire application. If you go to the donation form, you can see this user field, username field, is taking the name from the object arriving from Facebook and populating that field. You can put in any type of food you would like to donate and select the drop-off location. That is going to our backend through a post request. If we go to our search, before I leave, you can see the donation has been submitted there, this object. If we go to our search component, which is the search engine for the user, you can see my basil plant has been added and rendered here. This is making a simple GET request to our backend. There's also a template literal search bar here to make a GET request to our backend also, which will bring back basil plant. Okay, so let's look at the code for our front end. I'd like to start with the login component. This was originally a class component brought in from Facebook's Meta for Developers API. It was originally a class component. However, with the class component, we were not able to use context. So I refactored this component to use React hooks and state. Here, I'm importing my auth context from my auth provider and taking this block, which arrives back from Facebook once we have logged in, with all of that data arriving. This block is what we see displayed in the console. As you can see for our auth provider here, this is setting up our state. It's taking the data from Facebook, setting it with the input field. And here we are wrapping our entire application, all of its children, with that context. If we were to go to app, you can see the context arrives at the top here, enveloping all of our components. So if we wanted to use the person's profile picture when they have donated rather than our name, we are able to do so. In the donations form, you can see how setting state and using state through React has been quite a detrimental part of this form. The username field here, as you can see, we are importing context. We're using handle submits on all of our input fields, of course, which is using Axios to post those inputs and data into our backend. So if we go down, you can see our forms. And for example, here you can see where our context is being added. Our search component works the same. This is making GET requests and fetch requests from our backend using Axios. Here is the search bar component, for example, using template literal. All of this is linked up to our backend, sending posts and GET requests. And this is the fundamental part of how our application is working. So on the front end, we did run into some problems along the way. These problems were solved. However, they were important learning curves for the both of us. For example, here in the login component, you can see that I have commented out a use effect block. This component is really important. As mentioned before, this holds our context throughout our entire application if we were to use. What this use effect was doing was setting a timer so that when the user logged in, over the course of 3 seconds, the window would then revert to the home page endpoint. However, what I didn't understand at the time is this was actually unmounting and remounting our entire application, therefore losing the context set in from the login component. So when we arrived at our donation form on the front end, this fb.name was null. So this was a very important problem to come across to understand the fundamentals of how React actually works.
In terms of our project organization, we followed agile methodologies. In practice, this means that we broke the project up into small manageable sections which we could each work on. This approach ensured we were in constant contact and allowed us to flexibly adapt to any issues we encountered and work through them together. Furthermore, this approach allowed us to prioritize certain sections of the project to deliver the MVP. We used Figma to draw out our MVP, and we also used it to draw out the structure of both our front end and our back end. In addition to this, we used Figma as a vision board to collate external resources for inspiration on how our application should work and the way it should look from pre-existing applications and websites. We used Git and GitHub as forms of version control, and we created 2 repositories, one for the front end and one for the back end. We both independently worked on these repositories and ensured to use Git branching to ensure we minimalized conflicts when merging to the main branch. In terms of our practical approach to writing code, we tried our hardest to emulate a professional software development environment. To do this, we utilized stand-ups in the mornings to prioritize our goals and talk through how we are going to achieve them. Following on from this, we would have a retro at the end of most weeks in order to discuss what we had each done and what we were moving forward with the following week. We used the Tuesday and Thursday sessions as a form of mob programming, both working together on issues that we had and calling in the tutors if we were encountering blockers that we couldn't solve. In addition to this, we remained in constant contact on Slack, ensuring that we were both up to date on what each other was working on and anything that had been pushed or was waiting to be merged into the main repository. With regards to problems and challenges we faced when building the application, I would argue there were 2 main issues. Our first issue was the somewhat steep learning curve surrounding Git and GitHub and the use of branches and merging, which we often encountered merge errors and conflicts, but we have both now learned to work through them and are better developers as a result of this. The second problem we found was a naivety surrounding the complexity of what we assumed would be simple structural additions to the application. We often spent quite a lot of time on these additions, which were often not relevant to the MVP. However, these additions do remain within our code, and Dan is now going to talk you through the future features we would like to add to the application.
I would just like to talk a little bit about the future features which we would like to implement into our application. We do have the bare bones of the application and the MVP going forward, but we're using a Facebook login. Now, through Meta for developers, you can actually implement a Facebook Messenger API, which I think would be a really nice implementation into this application. Rather than the users talking to each other on this platform, they're already logged in and logging in through a much larger application such as Facebook. So the implementation of Facebook Messenger just seems like the right thing to do. Also, we would like to have users to be able to reserve items, to click on an item on the search bar and to have that updated on the table as a reserved item. Whether we would do that with polling our GET request to constantly update our backend to render the reserved item, or a much more complicated notification system for the user. Another feature that we would like to add to our application, which is already in place, however not rendered to the front end as yet, is a API from givefood.org, which is a national open API working around food banks. Our application is about donating food and about a community, this is also part of that community to give food to the food banks. This API could call back food that's in need of local food banks nationally or regionally. I would like to have a page of the application which is showing certain items needed by certain food banks within a current location. Also to use Google Maps API to help find these food banks. The code is set up at the moment to fetch a mass amount of data from givefood.org. However, it's a case of filtering that search down to render a list of most needed items from local food banks.
Thank you very much for listening to our presentation. We'd like to give a big thank you to all the tutors, and in addition to that, we'd like to give a shout out to our cohort for helping to make this a really memorable and enriching experience. We'd like to give special thanks to 3 tutors. These are Stu for helping us to implement and understand use context in React, Dragos for helping us with a number of errors on our backend and helping us to understand the importance of migration tables. And finally, we'd like to thank Luke for helping us to implement and utilize the data that we took from the Meta API. Our social media links are all included on this slide, and we'd like to use this time to welcome any questions anyone in the audience may have. Thank you very much for listening.